Welcome to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Glad you're with us. We're here every week talking to interesting people and dealing with topical issues, and we have one today that's really been getting a lot of discussion, both in the city level and the state level.
Indeed. The Open Records Act, or Freedom of Information, is on a lot of people's radar screen right now because there's a lot of controversy about it, a lot of discussion about it. Legislature's considering doing some things, and we were fortunate enough this morning to have with us a guy who knows more about it than really anybody else. Bryan Dean from the Oklahoman, a staff reporter who's written about it, and he's going to tell us what's going on.
What are the benefits? What are the concerns? It's the Freedom of Information Act, today's topic on The Verdict.
Yes, your information today is free.
A greener planet, cleaner air, a healthy economy, national security, a smaller deficit and a stronger dollar, green jobs, better jobs, energy independence, warmth and light and transportation. These are the reasons Chesapeake champions natural gas every day.
Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate. We're accountants. We do taxes, business valuations, estate planning, and consulting. And we're right here in Oklahoma, working with the owners of small and medium-sized businesses. Steve Wilsey and Stuart Meyer have the resources and the experience. Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
Today, we're very fortunate to have Bryan Dean, a staff writer for the Oklahoman, joining us to talk about freedom of information issues. Bryan did his undergraduate work in journalism at the University of Oklahoma, and during that period of time had Professor Cornett for one or two of his classes. He has been with the Oklahoman since 2002. He covers, among other things, Oklahoma City and Oklahoma County activities. He's a former president of the Society of Professional Journalists, and he's the incoming president of Freedom of Information Oklahoma. And that's what we're talking about here today. Bryan, sure appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Several statutes in state of Oklahoma law covering Oklahoma's freedom of information. What are the Oklahoma statutes about?
Well, the two main ones we have are the Oklahoma Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act. Meetings obviously covers meetings, requires notification, requires that meetings be open to the public, sets guidelines for when you can meet in what's called executive session, which is essentially meeting in secret, as, for example, the council does to talk about things like ongoing litigation. And then with the Open Records Act, that deals more specifically with pretty much any record that's created by a government entity, and that includes everything from the city council agenda to the checks that they write to vendors. And so it pretty much includes everything, and it sets forth what actually is open and what exceptions there are for what you can keep closed.
Roughly, if you don't know specifically, how long have these statutes been in place?
The Open Records Act came about in I want to say the early to mid '80s is when it was passed eventually.
Okay.
And I can't remember exactly the Open Meeting Act, but I want to say
So
it's around
until
the same
then,
time.
there was just this higher level of what you called secrecy in government. I mean, elected officials didn't have to disclose nearly as much information as today is generally exposed.
Right. I mean, what you had was, an expectation by the taxpayers and the public that things would be fairly open, but no real requirements on exactly, what exactly that would mean.
I see.
Why do we have them? What's the purpose of open records or open meetings laws? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, it's funny when you go back to sort of how our government was founded and what we do, you can't really make educated decisions as a voter and make the system of government work if you don't have information. I mean, if you don't know what your government's up to, you can't really make those decisions. And so if you read the preamble, that our Open Records Act has a very strong, very good preamble that discusses its purpose. And it says straight out that it is to keep the public informed, and that people have a vested interest in their information because it helps them make those decisions. So stuff is considered to be open. And that's how you're supposed to read that act, is that it's supposed to be read in the light of that preamble, that everything should be open.
And typical of statutes, they get put on paper and everybody has a general understanding of what it means, and then all sorts of gray areas start developing. What exactly should be available? What should be off limits? And what's your point on that? I would expect, coming from the media, you think we should err on the side of more openness and not less openness.
Right. I mean, the legislature meets every year, and so every year they make it more and more complicated, and they pass more and more changes to it. And I mean, generally, yes. I think my personal view, and I think the view of most in my industry, is that the more that's open, the better we can inform the public, the more decisions they can make, and that sunshine, so to speak, is a disinfectant. So, in general, I would say that's what most of us believe, and I think that's what most people, if you really talk to them about it, think. But then there do get to be these gray areas where you can say that there are legitimate. I mean, one thing we run into all the time is law enforcement. I mean, if law enforcement is doing an ongoing investigation, for example, of something, should we be able to see all the notes that their detectives are taking while the case is going on? Well, probably not. And so there are exceptions for that. I mean, there are lots of them that seem reasonable, and some others that have been passed in that probably aren't as reasonable. So you just kind of go with what the legislature says, and hopefully you can make those battles.
In general, when we hear a 911 tape, is that the result of the Freedom of Information Act, or would that be public anyway?
No, that is, again, we request those all the time. Based on the Open Records Act, and sometimes we get denied. They say that it is part of an ongoing investigation, but often we can get a hold of them, and so it's just one of those constant battles.
So people always think of paper, but in this case, this is an audio conversation that falls under these guidelines.
Oh, and that's one of the areas that's really kind of grown and become kind of an issue, is not even just audio, but video, and more importantly, websites. You start talking about electronic communications, emails, text. I mean, there was a recent ruling by the AG's office that, say, for example, the mayor is conducting business on his personal cell phone that's of city business. If I, as a citizen, request his personal text messages off of his personal phone that have to do with government business, they have to give them to me, because it's essentially the briefcase. You can carry your own personal briefcase, but as long as it has government documents in it, those documents are open, is what the ruling is. And so there's all kinds of gray areas now with technology where that's kind of becoming, I mean, this was written in the early to mid 80s. There was no concept of the kind of electronic communications we have now.
At the time these acts were passed in Oklahoma, Stratton Taylor was President Pro Tem of the Senate and was a principal author of these bills, and has talked to me a little bit about them in other contexts, and has expressed to me the importance, as he put it, of transparency in government. And of course you see a lot of people running on a platform of more transparency and the like. Do these laws, do you think, facilitate transparency? I mean,
that's exactly what they're meant to do. I mean, they're the people's, essentially, looking glass into government. I mean, without these, I could not do my job without having these records open, these meetings open. I mean, every Tuesday I go to the city council meeting. Without the law to make that open, they could meet in secret, and we wouldn't know what they're doing. I mean, it's the primary way we know what our government is doing.
And it applies to all levels of government: city,
yes,
county, state.
Everything but federal. There's a different law. The Freedom of Information Act applies to at the federal level, but at the state and local level, yes, those state laws apply.
School boards.
Yeah. Anything organized government.
What is the Freedom of Information Organization?
Freedom of Information Oklahoma is a group. It's an interest group that's involved. It's a nonprofit, and that it's interested in advancing the cause of open government, essentially. And they put on a couple of programs every year. We do a First Amendment conference every fall, and then in the spring we do a Sunshine Conference where we talk about open government. And we give out awards, things like that. We also have a legal defense fund. We can put money into cases when people do try to file suit in these regards. it's made up of a mixture between everything from, on our board we have State Library Association folks, we have attorneys, we have journalists, we have academics, we even have some local government types. And it's really meant to be a place where people can, go that they can give us we can give answers on what exactly is in the laws and guidance on what they should do in that regard, and also to try to advocate for keeping those things open and putting pressure on our government folks to keep it open.
You mentioned Sunshine Week, and those Sunshine Week activities, I guess, have just concluded a little while back. Tell us generally what those programs were about.
Well, Sunshine Week started a few years ago as a sort of a week just to kind of promote open government, and it's a national effort, and newspapers, TV, libraries put on programs. There's coverage all over the country during that time, and the Oklahoman has been from the start really supportive of it.
So this is a nationwide celebration or activity.
It is, and in Oklahoma, we had a Sunshine Week conference put on by FOI Oklahoma, where we had a panel of all the gubernatorial candidates there, and then we discussed some of the ongoing issues with birth dates, which have been kind of a hot button issue with open government.
Perfect segue, because in the next segment we're going to get into, we talk about elected officials and what information they should have, but what about the employees of government? We all know in Oklahoma there's thousands of people who work in government. What information that they create should be available? We'll get into that with Bryan Dean of the Oklahoman when we return on The Verdict.
Most of the artwork that I produce is with colored pencil and watercolor. The subject matter that I use is, of course, Chickasaw. Most of my themes revolve around family and really that foundation that has been a part of Chickasaw life since ancient times. The Chickasaw Nation is a matriarchal society. You've got one lady, she's probably the oldest member of the family, that everybody goes to and that everybody reveres. That is something that every woman can look forward to in the Chickasaw Nation, because they are extremely important in the family. Maybe one day I will be a matriarch. I think this is probably the secret to the success of our government, is that we still have maintained that idea that family is the most important thing, and that we must minister to the family first, and then all other things will fall into place.
The oil and natural gas industry help provide a revenue that feeds our schools, providing a better education for not only my kids, but for children all over the state.
It will allow the schools to buy better equipment. We'll be able to hire qualified teachers, all around to have a better educational experience.
The future has never been brighter for our students here.
We should be very proud of the oil and gas industry in Oklahoma.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers and our guest Bryan Dean of the Oklahoman. We're discussing the Open Records Act. A lot of discussion these days about employees for city or county or state government and whether or not their birth dates should be provided by their employers, the city, the state, or the county. Your take on that issue?
Well, that's really where the battle is at this moment. I mean, right now, the ruling from Attorney General Drew Edmondson is that birth dates are presumed to be open record, and if a government agency wants to not provide them, then they have to do that on an individual basis and give a specific reason why. Say someone's being stalked or something, and I mean, I don't know what the reason might be, but what the Attorney General said is that you've got to have a reason beyond just general privacy fears.
You can't just have a policy that says we don't give those out.
Right, and we could, I mean, I could, afterwards we could talk about what the city's done with it, because they've actually read it differently than what the Attorney General has said he meant by it. But we have two issues going on, one of which is how governments are responding to that opinion, and the second is how the legislature is responding, because after this came out, this opinion was asked for by Debbie Leftwich, and she wrote a bill basically saying we will make them all secret, and that has it does not have a title on it, but it's gone through and the Senate and is now in the House, and they have not voted on it yet. But that's currently ongoing and is a source of a lot of controversy.
Has the governor made any public comment that would lead you to, or tell you how he might deal with that if it does pass?
He has not. Now, again, at this conference we had, here last month for Sunshine Week, all the gubernatorial debate, all the gubernatorial candidates, other than Drew Edmondson, said they would veto it. But obviously, Brad Henry was not there. So,
on our Oklahoma laws, it can be both a civil violation and a criminal violation, the violation of open meetings or open records, can it not? Now, I presume that tells us that the district attorneys or law enforcement people can enforce these laws, but also the private citizen can, or the newspaper or the media can.
Well, they have to because frankly, the DAs don't enforce it. I've made this joke before. If I went into a city council meeting and I smoked marijuana, you better believe I'd be getting arrested for a misdemeanor of possession of marijuana. But I can go in there all day long and violate a Open Meeting Act, and no one's going to charge me for anything. I mean, the prosecutions are, there's maybe 1 or 2 a year, and they're only when it's just extremely blatant, like when a city attorney has told the council during a meeting, if you do this, you will be breaking the law, and they do it anyway. That's when people get in trouble. I mean, even then, they don't actually end up serving jail time or paying a fine. They just end up doing community service or something. So.
Well, what's your perception? When are most of these laws violated? At what point in local government?
All the time. I mean, it sort of depends. I mean, this is.
Wait a minute. Be specific. Give me an example of a.
I'll give you an example. For meetings, it's executive sessions, and it depends upon what government agency you're talking about. For example, I cover the city council meetings. If you guys in the city council tried to violate the Open Meeting Act, I'd be on you like crazy, and you know it.
Yeah, sure we do.
But there are a lot of city councils out there and county commissioners out there that don't have media constantly.
I see. So I shouldn't be taking this personal. That's what you're saying.
Right. I'm not saying
there's
you're
a lot of
always
elected
violating,
officials.
yes.
There's a lot of small municipalities who might not have that oversight, and they may not have the staff around them who is alert to those issues and watching out for them to make sure that they don't violate, which we have. I mean,
right.
we're surrounded by people who want to make sure we don't violate those issues because they don't want to have the city embarrassed by violations.
And that's one of the biggest problems we face is that even when there are city attorneys, often they don't really even read the law, or it's not their area of expertise. And we've had cases even where your attorneys who are, you guys have a lot more attorneys on staff who are a lot more versed on some of these issues, but they even don't always necessarily read this stuff before they act on it. I mean, it's not a law that comes into play that often. Only when people question it does it come into play. So often you have with the city attorneys, they're much more experts on, say, contract law or something like that. So it's one of those areas that doesn't come up enough, and people really aren't holding their government people accountable enough to it. And so their attorneys don't even always know what's in it. But the officials themselves are even less well versed. So.
A couple of issues here about the birth dates. One of the groups that's trying to protect those birth dates from getting to the public access is the employee groups, the unions, basically. What's their argument? Their
argument is it's twofold. One, they're worried about identity theft, and the second is they're worried about some sort of vague employee safety. And with, for example, the troopers, they're saying that we don't want troopers' information out there because someone they arrested could come to their house and hurt them or their family. So, I mean, there are problems with these arguments, and the first being that the information's already out there. I mean, we talk about birth date. It's in the state voter records. It's in the state driver records, which are already open. I mean, the state sells your driver records. They've made $65 million in the last 5 years selling driver information, and that includes your address, your name, your eye color, your height, your weight, your date of birth. I mean, the idea that this stuff's not out there, it's out there. I mean, it's trying to close the barn door after the horses are out. So,
well, tie for me the connection between birth date and being a state employee or city employee. How do those two things become important when they're put together?
The issue is identity here. I mean, the issue is who are you, and do we have a right to know who our state employees are? We have a right, obviously state employees or city employees, I can request their salaries. They're paid with public funds. We get to know how much they make. That's pretty well accepted. But, the problem we run into is not everyone out there has a very unique name. There are a lot of folks out there named John Smith and, Dave Parker. And how do you separate one from another? And the problem in our country is we have these common names, and when you have more than one person with the same name, how do you differentiate between two Dave Parkers? If I looked up on our state criminal records right now for John Smith, I'd come across hundreds of different John Smiths with all kinds of criminal records, and I would have no way of knowing whether any of those actually were a state employee named John Smith or not.
Let me interrupt you and put this in a little more context for me. These records are available elsewhere, but if you'd get the county registration rolls and find John Smith, that wouldn't tell you that that's the state employee you're asking about.
Right.
It would give you that information about that person, but you wouldn't be able to tie it to being a state or city employee. And the same with driving records.
Right, and the issue is being able to tie those two together. For example, criminal records are a big issue. What we like to check is background of employees. Well, criminal records all include date of birth. I can get a date of birth of somebody who's been arrested for murder, for example. If they've been charged, that's all on the state court records. But again, now if that person has a common name and they're a state employee, I have no way of knowing whether that John Smith is John Smith born June 2nd, 1976, or some other date. So, and that's the only way I can connect them back to being a state employee. If you want to compare those databases and be able to find out who is doing what, that's the only way you can really do it.
Well, do you feel like that at the state level there has been clarification on all these statutes so that local government should know clearly what they can give out and what they can't? Because what I hear is that local governments are concerned about lawsuits from their own employee groups if they give this information out. And so what they want is clarification, the freedom from the state, that no one's going to sue them and win if this information is freely distributed.
Well, I think a little bit of that is overblown because there is a specific point in the Open Records Act that says that governments will not be either personally or collectively liable for giving out information through the Open Records Act. So if you're, the Attorney General tells you to give this away and you do, and they try to sue you, you're protected. I mean, the law says you will not be liable for information you give out through the Open Records Act. Now, I know they'll say that they're worried about, say, an employee group suing them, but the other issue is you have to prove damage. And I've been covering this date of birth issue now for 4 or 5 years, and I've not seen one case anywhere in the country where someone has had their identity stolen off of, a public record with their birth date on it. It just doesn't happen. No one's been able to produce, in all the arguments that have gone on in Texas over the last few years it's gone to the courts, they've never been able to produce one victim. And if you can't prove damages, then you can't collect any money.
Look, we just have about 45 seconds left, but give me your quick take on should the legislature conveniently exempt them themselves
Yes, they did.
from the Open Meeting and Open Records Act, and there's some talk about getting trying to get the legislators text messages from lobbyists and the like covered by the Open Records Act. What do you think, real quick?
Obviously, as a journalist, I'd like to see them open. I mean, when they did this, it was a way to get it passed. The legislature didn't want. They claimed it would cinch up the legislative process if their stuff was all subject to this, and that's a nice, convenient excuse. But I think that people deserve to see what their legislatures are up to. So, seems reasonable to me that stuff would be open.
All right, just a few seconds left. Where's this headed? Anything going to happen in the next few months on this?
Well, the bill is currently up. The bill that would exempt birth dates is currently in the legislature. It's in the House, and we don't know yet whether that's going to pass or not. If that fails, there's also an ongoing court case where the OPEA, the State Workers Association, has tried to get an injunction put in place so that we've requested this from the state, and they're fighting that in the courts.
Bryan Dean with the Oklahoman on the Open Records Act. Bryan, great material. Thanks today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Kent and I'll have a final word right after this.
Blankenship has stopped at the line of scrimmage. No gain on the play. Leaving it 4th and 7 on the Tiger 46-yard line. 38 seconds on the clock. The Tigers have no choice but to go for it. Wiggins had to do the kicking. Here's the snap. And the kick is away.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
And welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We're wrapping up a show with Bryan Dean of the Oklahoman dealing with the Open Records Act.
Yeah, Bryan put it really in good perspective for me, and I hope for our viewers, about what the controversy is about and why some of these answers that seem simplistic may not be quite so simplistic. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
So many different levels of government, so many different ways to communicate. It's an ongoing issue that's never going to be totally resolved. But when you start bringing the employees of government in, that almost brings in a whole new layer. I think generally people think, well, these are my elected officials, whatever they do should be exposed to everyone.
Yeah, if you vote for them, it's fair game.
Right.
If you don't vote for them, it's prying into their privacy.
Yeah, but if you're simply an employee of government and you have a private life, how much of your information should be accessible? And is a birth date harmless? I think that's what we're coming back to, and I think that's what a lot of people who think those birth dates should be available, they're really just trying to protect the employee. In other words, they don't want to have a misidentification of someone who might be accused of something, and they're really just wanting to cross-reference and get their facts right. So I don't think there's any hidden agenda here, but it's playing out on the front lines with the media and the unions and the elected officials, and it's starting to bubble up to the surface, and I'm glad we had this discussion today.
Well, with Oklahoma's strong populist background from its formation to the very day, this is right the kind of thing that Oklahomans like to argue about.
We have a website. If you'd like to go there and tell us about a show you'd like to see on The Verdict, we'd like to hear from you. It's theverdict.tv. For Kent, I'm Mick, and we'll see you next week on The Verdict.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.
Okay, between 12 and 12:30, and then I'll call him in the car going in, but maybe if